You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. Welcome everyone to the final episode of our mini-series From Scroll to Screen, the Bible's Journey Through Time and Technology. Or at least the last episode for now, because as I was doing the study for this episode, I realized that I was trying to cram like 3 or 4 episodes worth of content into one episode, and I was wondering why it wasn't working. Well, that's why. There was just way too much info I was trying to get in here. And for anyone who follows this real time, I want to say thank you for your patience in giving us an extra week trying to make sure this episode is the best that it can be. As I was doing the study, I had originally planned to cover text traditions, like the textual families, the actual Greek and Hebrew texts that get put together to form our English Bibles. I was going to deal with translation to English, talk about King James onlyism, all of that. And the more I studied, the more I realized each of those is its own topic. And so today, just to finish out the conversation that we've been having the last several weeks, the most important thing to focus on is the textual criticism side of it, how these Greek and Hebrew manuscripts get put together and then form the Bibles that we read in English today. Now, I realize that may not sound crazy interesting right off the bat. It can seem really nerdy, but don't worry, we are going to make this as accessible as possible and do our best to have a fun time in the meantime. So just by nature of the conversation, we are going to still talk some about translations and the King James and all of that, but not as much as I had originally planned to. So if that was something you were looking forward to, don't worry, we are going to do future episodes on that. I haven't decided yet if that means we're going to do a From Scroll to Screen Part 2, if we're just going to turn this mini-series into a regular full-size series, or if that'll be its own mini-series as well. But we are definitely going to cover that, I promise you that, and we will probably be getting to it in this year. Upcoming. I am already looking at some awesome stuff we can do with those episodes and possibly even a guest or two that we could have on with it. So keep an eye out for those conversations coming to you in 2025. For now, though, we have to talk about the Greek and Hebrew texts that get put together to make up our English Bibles today. It is going to be all kinds of nerdy fun, so let's get to it. Just a few quick reminders here at the beginning from our previous conversations. First thing that you need to make sure you keep in the front of your mind today is that the Bible and the texts within it are ancient Jewish literature. Most of us read our Bibles in some form of English today. At least if you're listening to this, I assume you probably listen in English. Obviously, different people in different parts of the world read in different versions, but as far as I know, this podcast does not get translated into any other languages, so I'm guessing if you're listening to this, you probably read mostly in English. But it makes it really easy for us to assume subconsciously, like I don't think anyone would actually admit this or say they do it purposefully, it just kind of slips into our thinking. When we read the Bible in English, it can cause us to think that this is an English document and that Jesus and the disciples spoke English, or possibly even like a King James style English if you're into that particular translation. But that's not the case. These are old documents. Every single time that you read a Bible, you are reading a translation. You're not reading the originals. And even if you are reading the text in Greek and Hebrew, well, first of all, you're a nerd, and you're probably my kind of person. But even then, that is not the quote-unquote originals. We do not have any of the original texts. They're called autographs. When whoever wrote, say, the Gospel of Matthew or the Epistle to Hebrews or Genesis, there was originally a first copy. We don't have any first versions of any of the books of the Bible. And that makes sense when you think about it. If you've ever seen even just a book from, a couple hundred years ago, it's in really delicate condition. The pages can break really easily. Well, make that 2,000 years ago instead of 200 years ago, or even 1,000 years or 700 years ago. And then add into that some of the earliest manuscripts were written on papyrus. It wasn't until later that they started using vellum, animal skin, started binding it into codices. It's not going to last forever. So that's not necessarily anything to be concerned about, that we don't have the originals. We do have manuscripts that go as far back as roughly 100-ish to 200-ish years after Jesus for the New Testament, and going about 100 to 200 years before Jesus for the Old Testament, or the Tanakh. Now, that brings up a good point that I might as well make here at the front as well. The majority of our conversation today is going to revolve around the New Testament. I am going to mention the Tanakh from time to time in this, but just because the scribal practices were different from the Tanakh into the New Testament, most of the debate around textual issues revolves around the New Testament. There are absolutely issues to talk about with the Hebrew Tanakh, but most of it is going to revolve around the New Testament, so just wanted to throw that out there. Okay, just a few quick terms here. We already addressed autographs. Those are the originals that would have come from the pens of the quills, I suppose, of the original authors. We don't have any of those. A manuscript, then, is a handwritten copy of that. So if you were to, I don't know, type out the Gospel of Matthew in a Word document, that's not a manuscript. It is a handwritten copy, and it's usually going to be roughly up until the time of printing becoming more popular with like the printing press and all of that. So when we talk about biblical manuscripts, we're not necessarily just talking about stuff from the first century. We're talking about anything from the time that it was copied for the very first time all the way up into the Middle Ages. In fact, the majority of the biblical manuscripts that we have are from within the last 1,000 to 500 years of human history. They are from medieval times. Not all manuscripts are ancient. A lot of them are just very old. Exactly how many manuscripts we have is not really well known. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is just that that's the sort of thing that really, really, really nerdy scholars care about, and the average person doesn't, so it's not the sort of thing that you can easily find with a Google search. Now, if you were to search it, you will find some numbers, but there's a lot of conflicting information, and that's because a lot of the information available to the public is kind of dated. You'll be getting figures from 20 plus years ago that were just written in books and then, passed along like that. The actual number of known biblical manuscripts that we have changes relatively frequently because manuscripts are still being discovered. And a big part of that, too, is the whole idea of people who would collect manuscripts was pretty big, a couple hundred years ago. Even into today, you look at something like the Hobby Lobby family that was trying to collect all these different biblical artifacts. This is not the topic of today's conversation. I highly recommend, if you are interested in talking about like collecting biblical manuscripts and all that, the podcast Biblical Time Machine has done an episode or two on, it's called Provenance, and figuring out like where these different biblical artifacts and all that come from, and trying to make sure they're legitimate because there are a lot of forgeries out there. So that makes the whole conversation of how many manuscripts are out there difficult because many are part of private collections. And a lot of times these private collections are not necessarily open to scrutiny to determine if they're even valid in the first place. So not every biblical manuscript that has ever been found has been cataloged. And that's a big project just in the last 20-ish years of trying to digitize all of these different manuscripts and put them in a format where people all around the world can view them. I mean, just imagine even 100 years ago, even 60 years ago, if you wanted to view different biblical manuscripts, you would have to go and find them wherever they may be housed. Like, you couldn't just check the internet for them. So it's a very painstaking process that is slowly becoming easier and more accessible, but it's still a really nerdy thing. So in the show notes, I have copied links to some different websites that collect these manuscripts and digitize them and make them available to the public. They are in varying degrees of ease of use. They are pretty nerdy, and a lot of it relies on German scholarship, so sometimes it's even foreign data that can be hard to translate over. But I wanted to at least put those out there so the few of you that may be interested in that can trace that rabbit trail down a little bit further. But in general, the number that you'll usually see thrown around for manuscripts of the New Testament is 5,800. So roughly around 6,000 manuscripts of the New Testament exist in Greek. For reference, there are somewhere around 2,000 manuscripts of Homer's writings. Granted, he was writing when most of the Tanakh stories were still in oral form or early written form, and the New Testament was still several centuries away from being written. But that gives you a little bit of a reference point to say that we have roughly triple that just for the New Testament, just in Greek, mind you. Once you start adding in other languages, because these texts got translated over into other languages, we have roughly 10,000 New Testament Latin manuscripts and close to 10,000 manuscripts in other languages like Syriac and Aramaic and a number of other translations. The number of manuscripts for Old Testament texts for the Tanakh, that's even harder to find. It seems to be roughly in the couple thousand-ish range, especially if we consider the Greek translations of it in the Dead Sea Scrolls. But I'm just going to be honest with you, it was really difficult to find anything on the number of manuscripts for the Old Testament. New Testament was difficult to get an updated number, but it was hard to find much of anything on the Tanakh texts. What I could find is that some of our earliest verified copies of anything from the Tanakh are the Ketef Hinnom scrolls, which have just little portions of the Book of Numbers, and they're from roughly 600-ish years before Jesus. And then the next thing we have are the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are like 100-ish years before Jesus. We do have the Septuagint translation, the Syriac Peshitta. Once Jerome translates the text into Latin, we have the Vulgate. And then eventually, a few hundred years after Jesus, we have the collation of all of the Tanakh together by the Masoretes, getting into the Masoretic text. And we have record of that with the Aleppo Codex, which I think I talked about a couple weeks ago, where that used to be our oldest full codex of the Hebrew Bible, but it was damaged. So now the Leningrad Codex is our oldest full copy. We also deal with the Samaritan Pentateuch, the Targums, Egyptian Coptic texts. So these are all different forms of manuscript tradition where we have some portion of Hebrew text that matches what we have in the Bible. But as you may have noticed from my going down that list, not all of them, in fact, most of that is not full copies of the Tanakh. We only have that with the Leningrad Codex. See, when we're talking about manuscripts, it's really easy to assume, like a whole scroll of any given Bible book. Like, say you have a whole manuscript of the book of First Corinthians or the book of Matthew or Leviticus or whatever. But the majority of manuscripts are not whole books, let alone whole copies of the Bible. Again, parchment, papyrus, even codices break down over time. So the majority of manuscripts that we have are just fragments. Fragments that include parts of books, parts of chapters, maybe even just a handful of verses. Some of our smallest biblical manuscripts are smaller than a business card. Like, that is all that was recovered of some of these texts. And as scholars began to pore over it and study it, they realized, oh, it matches this particular passage. And so then it is considered one of our manuscripts, even if it is just a really small fragment like that. Now, not all are like that. We do have some that include whole books or even collections of books, like some of the epistles or the Gospels or anything like that. But the majority are fragmentary texts. And remember as well that not all manuscripts look exactly the same. There are different types of manuscripts. The oldest tend to be papyri manuscripts. They were written on papyrus, and there seem to be like 150-ish of those for the New Testament. A few weeks back, we talked about how older Greek texts only wrote in basically capital letters and often without spacing or accent marks or punctuation or anything like that, and they were called majuscules or sometimes uncials. We have around 350 of those for the New Testament. And then as time went on and these texts were refined by scribes, they started adding in spaces between the words, lowercase letters, all that. It came to be called minuscules. And that really came into play about 600-ish years after Jesus, although there were still some majuscules being written at that time as well. This is our biggest collection of New Testament manuscripts. There are close to 3,000 minuscules that have been recorded. So catch that. The vast majority of our New Testament manuscripts, roughly 3,000 of around 6,000, all come from at least 600 years after Jesus, if not more. And then the last grouping is codices. Codices are collections of manuscripts together, and so they can have manuscripts that reflect different text traditions. Codices are not necessarily copied by all one person. Copying is really hard work, and if you have never tried this, I would highly recommend open up a Bible to any given page, doesn't matter what page, get a blank piece of paper, and just try to copy down by hand that one single page of the Bible. And then go back and see what mistakes you made. I can almost guarantee you will have made some mistakes in the process of copying down just one page. It's really tough, and it's also really tiring, and it hurts your hand. So imagine having to do that for an entire book of the Bible, let alone the entire Bible. So that was usually a group effort to do these codices, and sometimes they would even collect manuscripts from different text traditions. We'll talk about the text traditions in a few minutes and what exactly that means. But it's possible to have a codex that has some texts that may have come from one part of the world combined with some that likely came from another part. We only have a small handful of codices because they took a lot of work. I mean, today, if you wanted to write a book, you could self-publish. You could publish a 500-page book on your own and have it out there for the world in a short amount of time. That wasn't possible 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago. It took a lot of work and a lot of money just to copy down one book of the Bible, one of these scrolls, let alone to combine them all together into one and then bind them into a codex. So those are very precious documents, the few that we have. There's one other way that we can have like a manuscript from back then that I don't think I mentioned in any of the previous episodes, and that's something called a lectionary. It's not technically a manuscript in that it's not like, say, a copy of the book of First Corinthians or anything like that. Rather, lectionaries were used by the church to have different portions of scripture read in church communities over time. And if you come from a more liturgical church tradition, you may still use a lectionary where there are different passages read each week and it jumps around the Bible like that. So those also are part of our textual record. In fact, they're a pretty significant part of our textual record, making up roughly 2,500 of the manuscripts that we have, where they are not necessarily, say, like Genesis chapter 1 straight through Genesis chapter 40, but rather maybe have a little bit of Genesis here, next to a little bit of Matthew, next to a little bit of Romans or what have you, as a lectionary reading. So we have a large number of manuscripts, both for the Old and New Testaments, but we don't necessarily have a lot of early ones. We've already established that we don't have any of the originals. We also don't have any of the first set of copies, or probably any of the second, or third, or fourth set of copies. Aside from a couple exceptions, the majority of our manuscript trail for the Old Testament, for the Tanakh, it only starts about 200-ish years before Jesus, which would have been right around the time that the Old Testament canon was established. Now, again, like we talked about a couple weeks ago, many of those stories are centuries older than that. They began as oral traditions that then got written down and then got copied and then got edited and eventually got put together into the Old Testament canon that we have. But we don't really have any of those early versions. We just have the edited forms from about 200 years before Jesus moving forward. And then with the New Testament, the earliest we have is from roughly 100-ish years after Jesus, and we only have a couple fragments from that time period. Moving into the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries, we have a few more. Moving into the 4th century, we get a few more. 5th century, we start to get more. We have to go about 400 years after Jesus before we even have 100 manuscript fragments of the New Testament. And that number steadily grows and grows until we get to about 900 to 1,000 years after Jesus. And that's where we start getting a lot more manuscripts of the New Testament. It just continued to get copied and copied and copied and passed along so that it would continue into perpetuity. I mean, if you wanted, say, a copy of one of Mark Twain's books from 150 years ago, you could order it off of Amazon and have no doubt that what you are reading is an accurate copy of what he wrote. We have now digitized copies of these old books, and we just assume whoever orders this is getting the same thing as anybody else who orders it. But back then, everything had to be copied by hand, and you had no way of uploading everything to the cloud to make sure that it existed for future generations. So it just continued to get copied and copied and copied. And over time, as Christianity spread and more people became literate and just population increased around the world, there was more and more need for copies of the Bible to continue to be made. And when you copy something down by hand, it doesn't matter how good you are at it. there are going to be mistakes, especially in a longer document like a whole scroll from the biblical text. I mean, just think about going out to eat and you have a waitress with the little pad taking your order, writing it down right as you say it, and yet there are still times where you get the wrong order brought to your table. And that's right after you have said it. I mean, like immediately after. And we can make mistakes on just a few words. You get sent to the store with a shopping list and you forget to copy down something, or you put something down twice accidentally, right? Like, it is very easy to make these mistakes. And so, even though we have thousands upon thousands of manuscripts from the Bible, there's basically no two that are exactly alike, even for the same passage. There are going to be variations in all of these different manuscripts. And these variations in the text are very cleverly called textual variants, or sometimes just variants, or occasionally variant readings, or even sometimes just readings. So if you hear any of those terms, textual variants, variants, variant readings, or readings, that's talking about when you have two or more manuscripts of a biblical text, of the same text, side by side, and there's a difference between them. And this is where people start to get really nervous, because a lot of people don't even like talking about the differences between our English Bibles, let alone talking about differences in Greek or Hebrew manuscripts. It's hard enough when we're dealing with our own language, throw in a language that you're not familiar with, and it can get really confusing and concerning fast for a lot of people. But I want to be here to tell you, this is not something that we need to be concerned about. And I will explain why as we continue on through here. Hopefully, through what I'm able to talk through, it will show you this is not a major matter for concern. These variations are real. If you've ever had someone, a preacher of any kind, tell you there are no variations in the biblical text, that's just wrong. It's a lie. There absolutely are. No two manuscripts are exactly the same, even if they are for the same passage. Now, the number of textual variants that there are, that is really hard to determine, and you can get anything from a few thousand all the way into hundreds of thousands of variations depending on who you read. Either way, it is absolutely in the thousands, and it is a lot. I mean, if we're going off of the realization that no two manuscripts are exactly alike, and if we combine the Old and New Testament numbers together, we have, what, roughly around 8,000 plus manuscripts? Well, that's going to be 8,000 plus variations between them. And it could very well go into the tens or even hundreds of thousands of differences, depending on how you count it. And this is where it's really important, because you have to understand a textual variant is not necessarily having, say, like two different versions of a verse where they say completely opposite things. That's not really how textual variants work. The majority of textual variants are something as simple as a spelling difference. For example, there's something called the nomina sacra. That's when someone abbreviates a divine name or possibly even name of Jesus in a text, partly to save space, also partly out of respect. So let's say you have two different manuscripts of the same passage side by side. One of them says Iesu Christou, Jesus Christ. But then the other uses the nomina sacra, which is going to be an iota and a key. So it's going to look like an I and an X side by side. And there'll be often a line put over those two letters to indicate this is a divine name. So you're just going to know by looking at that, okay, that's Iesu Christou. It's Jesus Christ right there. That counts as a textual variant for most scholars. So even though they are saying the exact same thing, that can be counted as a textual variant. Sometimes names in the Bible, particularly in the New Testament, can be declinable, where, based in the Greek, the spelling of the name can change depending on what part of speech it is in the sentence. So, like in English, if you have my name in a sentence, Colin, it doesn't matter what role my name is playing in the sentence, you always spell it Colin. You do not change the spelling of my name, whether I'm the subject or the object. However, in Greek, you sometimes can, like Jesus' name. In some cases, it might be Jesus. In others, it might be Iesun. And it's going to depend on what part of speech it is in the sentence. So a textual variant could be one person spells it as Jesus, another spells it as Iesun. Either way, it is the exact same name. It doesn't change anything about the text. It's just a slightly different spelling. A misspelling can be a textual variant. So if you have one text that has, let's say, the word for revelation, apocalypsis, And then let's say you have another manuscript where the scribe had a spelling error and he said apocalypsis instead of apocalypsis. He did an iota instead of the upsilon, an I instead of the U. That is a textual variant. Again, it changes absolutely nothing about the passage. We know it's still the word apocalypsis. We know it's revelation, but the spelling difference makes it a variant. Or let's say we have three manuscripts together, and one of them says Jesus went into a city. The next one says Jesus went into the city. And the third one says Jesus went into Jerusalem. Okay, those count as three different textual variants, even though it's about the exact same word in the exact same passage. So it's not, oh, there's a variation here, that's one variation. No, every single option of what it could be counts as a variation. So that's why sometimes the numbers can be so high, like 400,000 or more variants. Daniel Wallace is a very well-known textual scholar who has provided a very helpful delineation here where he says some variants are viable, and that means that they're authentic, like that is actually a legitimate variation, but they're not meaningful. So he contrasts viable with meaningful. So just because we have 2, 3, 10, 20 different possibilities of what it could possibly be. Is it Jesus went into a city, the city, or Jerusalem? Let's imagine that all three of those are viable options for the text. They're not necessarily meaningful differences, particularly if they came shortly after a verse that mentioned his being near Jerusalem. Well, then we could deduce, even in the cases of a city and the city, it's probably talking about nearby Jerusalem that was already mentioned. So it doesn't really affect the actual text itself. That's really important to understand in this conversation. When we talk about textual variants, we are not talking about changing doctrine. There is no manuscript that says God is hate rather than God is love. I think I borrowed that from Bart Ehrman. There was somebody who gave that as an example. Like, I think a lot of Christians, they hear textual variants and they're thinking the message of the Bible is being changed. No, there is nothing that's taking God so loved the world and changing it to God really hated the world. Most textual variants are really small, insignificant things. They're often spelling issues. And most of the time, they were probably accidental, too. They weren't done by any malicious act of a scribe trying to change the message of the Bible. Like, having come from King James only circles, I heard growing up, and even in college, that all these other versions were perversions created by the devil and humans that worship the devil, and they just wanted to change the meaning of the Bible. You know what? If that's true, they really failed. Because even in manuscripts that don't include particular verses, like this is a whole other issue. If you're into textual stuff and translations at all, you've probably heard of missing verses, quote unquote, in certain Bibles. Like, oh, the NIV doesn't have 1 John 5, 7 through 8 that talks about the Trinity. So, it's trying to take out the Trinity from the Bible. But no, even instances where there are manuscripts that don't have certain verses, that's not necessarily done maliciously or with the intent to change doctrine. If you wanted to completely remove the idea of the Trinity from the Bible, you would have to do a lot more than take out 1 John 5, 7 through 8. There are other passages than just that one that get brought into the Trinity discussion. And so whenever somebody says, oh, these versions are just trying to change the message of the Bible and change doctrine, I'm going, well, if that's the case, they really failed because they would have to change so many other passages than just a few disputed ones. Like, for example, most early manuscripts, and this is going to be reflected in more recent English Bible translations, they will leave out Romans 16:24, which says, "The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you all, amen." But I have never once heard someone claim that not having that verse there removes Jesus as being the Christ. Because, it says the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, and so they must have been trying to get rid of Jesus being the Christ. No, anyone who has ever read the New Testament knows that's all throughout the New Testament. Like, that is the central theme of the New Testament, is Jesus is the Christ. So just because there's not one verse in there that says that, doesn't mean that changes the whole doctrine. It's in other verses as well. I didn't really want to get into that today because that is a whole other discussion, but I kind of knew I was going to end up on that rant one way or the other. I imagine at this point that many of you are in a different place as you're listening to this, because there are some of you, especially if you came from a hard King James only kind of background like I did, you may be a little on edge with somewhat of what I've been saying. Or if you came from maybe a little bit more of an evangelical background where you could just use whatever version of the Bible you wanted, you might be kind of scratching your head at some of what I'm talking about. I'm like, wait, this is actually an issue for some people? Yes, it is a major issue, and it's something that we need to talk about more. So we are going to do future episodes about translation, about King James, and also I want to do an episode on verses that are not in certain Bibles, because that is actually a thing where there are roughly 16 verses that are not going to be in certain English translations of the Bible. That's usually the thing that freaks someone out. You know, they get to like Matthew 17:21 and they see that it's missing in some of the Bibles. It's just going to go from Matthew 17:20 to Matthew 17:22, and they're like, what happened to 21? So if you're thinking along those lines, don't worry. We are going to cover that at a future date, because that just has to be its own thing. There's no way I can talk about each of those 16 passages and do them justice in this episode, and possibly not even in one episode. That may end up being a couple, but we'll see. We will get there in the future. Just for now, I will say even that is not necessarily something that you should be concerned about. And I think as we continue through this episode, you will understand why. It's not a matter of someone trying to take out verses from your Bible or change the message of your Bible. It actually all just comes down to good people doing good scholarship who want to try to get as close as possible to the original texts as they would have been written by their original authors. And that's where we get into something called text criticism. So we're going to talk about that next here. First, let's just take a quick break, stretch, go for a quick walk, get a drink of water, whatever you need. Just give yourself a quick brain break, because I know some of this can get really heady. So we'll take a quick break, and then we will talk about textual criticism. Textual criticism is another term that can scare people away when they hear it. And that's understandable. It sounds like you're being critical of the Bible, but that's not at all what it means. The term textual criticism has nothing to do with criticizing the Bible. Textual criticism, it can sometimes be broken down into two different forms called higher and lower criticism. Higher criticism is about trying to figure out the background of a biblical book. Like, I don't know, I seem to keep using 1 Corinthians as an example today, so we'll go with that. You're trying to figure out who exactly wrote 1 Corinthians. You know, it claims to be Paul. Was it actually Paul? Where was it written? Around what time do we think it was written? What would have been the context of Corinth at that time? All of that sort of thing. But usually when someone says text criticism, they are referring to what is sometimes called lower criticism. And it's not often called that, I don't think. I tend to see that more so in conservative circles, where they'll try to make the difference between higher and lower criticism, or at least turn the lower criticism part of it into an insult and the higher criticism part into, being a little bit snobby about the other form of study. But that's not the way it's meant to be taken. Textual criticism is not just studying the biblical text or trying to analyze the texts. It's very specifically attempting to reconstruct the original text that the author would have written when we do not have the originals. We've already established today that no two biblical manuscripts are exactly alike, even if you have, say 100 manuscripts that all cover Matthew chapter 1. Well, there are going to be differences in each of those manuscripts where they do not agree with each other. And that doesn't necessarily count as 100 variations. It's going to count as a heck of a lot more, because you have to consider how they all differ within each other. So the role of the text critic then is to come in, look at those 100 manuscripts of Matthew 1, and try to put them into groups to figure out which ones are coming from the same general background, which ones have the same set of variations in them, where, let's say there's a spelling error in one set, and you note that, I'll say 20 out of the 100 all have the exact same spelling error. You can guess, okay, they all probably came from the same general region, or were all copied on the same prior text. And so you kind of set those aside in their own thing, and then you see, say, another 15 that all are missing one particular verse of the passage, and you say, okay, those all probably came from the same area, and you group those together. And once you've put them all into different groups, the text critic is then trying to determine which of these most closely represent what the original text likely would have been. And since we don't have any originals, it's all educated guesswork. Heavy emphasis on the educated side, because there are reasons that one text will be chosen over another, but there is still a lot of debate over why one text should be considered closer to the original than another. We'll get into all that reasoning in a minute here. I want to point out first, though, that text criticism is not just about the Bible. There were text critics in the libraries of Alexandria, Egypt, over 100 years before Jesus. See, in a world where not everything is digitized, there are going to be differences, and you want to try to get back to the original. Like, humans have been wanting to do that for as long as we have been collecting together more than one copy of a particular book. Today, if you buy a book off of Amazon, you assume that you are reading the exact same thing that anyone else who buys that copy of the book off of Amazon is reading. But when we're copying things by hand, there are going to be slight variations. And again, most of this is not intentional. It's not malicious. Most of it is not even significant. It's going to be small variations in spelling or maybe a word out of place here or there. And that's not just connected to the Bible. In fact, this happens a lot with Shakespeare. We don't have originals of Shakespeare's plays. We have collections of copies of them. And so there are actually text critics of Shakespeare. And I have even linked on our notes for this episode a website called Shmoop. Yes, I'm not making that up. It's actually called Shmoop. It is a teaching aid where teachers can have notes and review stuff for class. And somebody there has class notes for textual criticism of Shakespeare. And I thought it was really cool as I was reading through some of it. Like, I'm not a Shakespeare scholar by any means. I've only read a few of his plays anyway. But I thought just removing it from the context of the Bible and putting it in the works of Shakespeare really helps to take some of the scare factor out of the conversation. And it's easier just to understand what the conversation is about. So I definitely recommend checking out that link if you're interested in what we're talking about here. So the text critic is trying to determine, out of all of these manuscripts, and all of the variations amongst them, what is most likely to be the closest thing that we can determine to the original, to what would have come out of the quill of the original author. And, Shakespeare's only 400 years old, and we're debating those sorts of things. And again, just like with the Bible, most of it is relatively, I don't want to say insignificant, but it's not a major issue that is changing the entirety of the story. It's more so just going to be a word here or there. Now, as the text critic does this study, they are going to have what's called a critical apparatus. This is going to be their notes, and it's going to show, here are the different manuscripts that I've used, here are the variations in those manuscripts, here's why I think this one is closer to the original than others, and a bunch of other notes, but that's the really important stuff. And using this critical apparatus, the textual critic will create a critical edition. This is the text that they have determined is going to be closest to the original. So, going back to our 100 manuscripts on Matthew 1, by the way, this is all hypothetical. I'm just throwing out round numbers as illustrations. But, let's say we have this 100 manuscripts of Matthew 1, and we're trying to determine what is most likely to be closest to what the author of Matthew originally put in. So once they work through the critical apparatus and have looked at all of these different manuscripts, recorded the variations, and made their determination of what they think is closest to the original, they will then, in today's day and age, we would say copy and paste. A couple hundred years ago, it was all by hand. But they will copy and paste from each manuscript what they think is closest to the original. So if manuscript A is most likely to be closest to the original in verse 1, they'll use that. But then let's say manuscript C is more likely to be close to the original in verses 2 through 4. So then they'll take those out of manuscript C and put them next to verse 1 from manuscript A. And then, verse 5, the first half of it is probably closest to the original in manuscript F. So you take some of that from there. So you see you're adding all these different pieces together to create a critical addition that they then will say, this, as far as we can tell, based on what we have available to us today, is the closest to the original message of the Gospel of Matthew that we can determine. Now, some of you may be thinking, How do they determine that? What questions do you ask to decide if a text is closest to the original or not? Well, put yourself in those shoes. Let's imagine you are the text critic and you have 100 manuscripts of Matthew chapter 1 in front of you. How would you determine which manuscripts are closest to the original? By the way, in this conversation, I am assuming that all hypothetical manuscripts in question are valid and they are not forgeries, because that's a whole other matter that we don't have time to talk about today. That would actually be something that would be addressed even before any of these questions would be asked, as it would go to someone who is able to determine the validity of the text, make sure it's not a forgery from 50 years ago that someone made to look weathered as if it was 1,500 years old instead of 50. So just assuming that these hypothetical texts we're talking about are real. Well, from about the time of Jesus until roughly 1,500 years later, so about 500 years ago, the general guiding principle was go with whatever the majority of manuscripts available to you say. And that makes sense. Let's say you have 10 manuscripts in front of you, 2 of them say Jesus went into the city, and 8 of them say Peter went into the city. Well, it makes sense. You would say, well, if we have 4 times the number that say Peter went into the city, it's probably likely that that would be the accurate reading. And that was the logic that was used for about 1,500 years. And that makes sense, because people back then didn't have access to technology to very accurately determine how old a manuscript would be. So just about the only factor you could go off of is how many of these agree versus disagree. That was pretty much the only thing available to them. And remember, back then too, you only had so many manuscripts that you could find. Like now we have roughly 6,000-ish for the New Testament alone. Well, the majority of those have been found in the last 200 to 300 years. So imagine you're in a monastery 500 years ago, and you want to obtain as many manuscripts of the Bible that you can and put them together and try to determine the closest thing to the original message of the Bible that you can. And because you're living 500 years ago, you have no access to anyone else's work on this. You don't know that anyone else has ever tried to make a critical edition. You only have access to what is in your little monastery. How are you going to do the work of obtaining these manuscripts to put together a critical edition? Well, you can't check online. You can't put in a call to a university the next country over and see what they have. You have to travel and go to where, rumor has it, there are manuscripts of the biblical text, and hope that they are still there. And if they are still there, hope that the people who are holding on to them are willing to share them with you for your studies. So even though the general guiding principle was go with whatever the most manuscripts say, well, you might only have access to 5 manuscripts. And so the majority reading is whatever 3 or more of them say. Or if 3 of them have differences and 2 of them don't, well, you're going to go with 2 out of the 5 as the majority, quote-unquote, reading for that passage. The average person trying to study manuscripts up until a couple hundred years ago would never have even had access to 200 total manuscripts. Honestly, for most of them, they wouldn't have even had access to 100 or possibly even 50 different manuscripts. It really boomed in the last couple hundred years, not just as new manuscripts have been found, but also as they have been better collected and recorded. Because as we start getting into the last couple hundred years, now we have easier travel, whether by train or plane or car, where you don't have to walk over to the next monastery and see if they have any manuscripts of the Bible. Now we can call and say, hey, what manuscripts do you have? Or most of it is online now and digitized, so you can just see it even from the comfort of your own home. That wasn't even the case 300 years ago. But as more texts have been discovered and become more accessible to scholars, new guidelines for determining what is closest to the original have arisen. One of the earliest people to do some of this work of creating newer guidelines for determining the original message of a passage was Johann Albrecht Bengel. He lived in the late 1600s into the early 1700s, and in 1734, he created a critical edition of the Greek New Testament. And one of his main guiding principles was that whenever you have 2 or more manuscripts that differ, the one with the harder reading is to be preferred as likely being older and closer to the original. You might be going, harder reading? Like, what are you talking about here? To illustrate, let's look at John chapter 4. This is the story of Jesus and the woman at the well. In verse 9, it reads, "Then said the woman of Samaria to him, 'How is it that you, being a Jew, asks a drink from me, who am a woman of Samaria? Because the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans.'" Some manuscripts don't have the end of that verse in there, "for the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans." So, based solely on this one rule from Bengal that the harder reading is to be preferred, any manuscripts that do not have that last sentence would be preferred. Here's what I mean by that. "For the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans" is an explanatory clause. It's saying this is why the woman was so concerned about this interaction with Jesus, or so surprised by this interaction. It is explaining the background to say, "Psst, dear reader, this is because the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans." Like, it's putting those words in her mouth. Without that explanation, some readers might not understand what the confusion would be about. Not everyone realized there was such hostility between the Samaritans and the Jews of Jesus' day. So we have two or more manuscripts, let's just say two for simplicity's sake. One includes that explanatory clause at the end of verse 9, and another does not have it. Only one of those can be closest to the original of what the author of John wrote. But either way, it doesn't change the message of the verse. All it does is add or take away a little bit of explanation of why what happened happened. So Bengal's thought process was that it is less likely for a scribe to have seen that explanatory clause in there and removed it than for it not to have been there originally and a scribe to have added it in. If you think about it, there's really nothing you stand to gain from removing that clause, aside from, I guess, saving a part of a line on your parchment paper. Like, there's nothing that changes the verse by removing that from there. However, it is entirely plausible that the verse could have originally not had that explanatory clause. A scribe came along later and said, "Oh, my audience might not know that background. Let me add this in." So since the option where there is no explanatory clause there makes a potentially more difficult read for someone who doesn't know that background, Bengal would say that is more likely to be closer to the original because it is more likely that a scribe added in the explanatory clause than that they took it away for some reason. Now, that is by no means foolproof, and his methods are certainly a matter of debate, but it is a significant turning point in the process of textual criticism when Bengal started to popularize this way of thinking about text criticism. He also worked with a German scholar, Johann Salomo Semler, and together they were some of the first scholars we have record of who tried to group these manuscripts together into different text families to say, okay, these all have the same spelling error here, so they likely came from the same place. These all have the same missing verse here, so they likely came from that place, that sort of thing. And that's certainly not a foolproof method, but it's really important because just because a text was discovered somewhere doesn't necessarily mean that's where it was originally housed or even where it was originally written or intended to belong to. So let's just say, for instance, you find an old biblical manuscript in the cellar of a monastery somewhere in, I don't know, France. That doesn't mean that manuscript has been there the entire time. It may have been moved there at some point. Let's say it was discovered by someone 200 years ago and stored in that cellar and forgotten about. Well, the person who found it may have found it, I don't know, somewhere south of Jerusalem. And it may have ended up there, let's say, 1500 years earlier when someone was carrying a copy of this manuscript from one church to another, and maybe they got robbed and the manuscript fell out of their satchel and fell into a hole in the ground and stayed there for 1500 years. Okay, well then you even have to ask the question, the person who was carrying it wasn't probably the person who copied it originally, so who copied it and where did they do it? So yeah, you have to ask all of these background questions to say, where did this come from? And Bengal and Semler figured that the majority of texts can fit within one of three different categories. They said Alexandrian, Western, and Byzantine. And this was also agreed upon by another scholar around the same time, Johann Jakob Griesbach. We'll talk more about these different text families and why not everyone agrees on how they should be divided up in a few minutes here. Back to Griesbach, he also published editions of the Greek New Testament, and in 1796 he added 15 rules for textual criticism. He agreed with Bengel's ruling that the harder reading should be preferred. He also suggested that the shorter reading is preferred, because he said that it was more likely a scribe would add something to a manuscript than remove it from the manuscript. So if we go back to our illustration of John 4:9, the exact same rules apply. Just like the manuscript without the explanatory clause would be considered more likely to be closer to the original message because it's a slightly harder read, it would also gain points for being the shorter reading. Now, just like any of these guidelines for text criticism, this one is definitely debated, because I have heard some people suggest, well, actually, a longer reading is more likely to be original because, sometimes people remove things by accident or take it out, and then others say, no, the shorter one is more likely to be original. So there's debate around this. This is one of the rules that is generally accepted by text critics today, but there is absolutely pushback because there's no real way of knowing who would be more likely to add something or take it away. This all really comes to a head in the late 1800s with the work of two men, Brooke Westcott and Fenton Hort. If you're into text criticism or translation stuff at all, you may have heard of Westcott and Hort. They're still very influential even to today. They refined the guidelines for text criticism into 9. They said that as much as possible, older readings should be preferred. The quality of the reading should matter more than the number of manuscripts that give a particular reading. If you have 3 manuscripts, well, 3 or more, and one says one thing, the other says another thing, and the third one combines those two together, the third one is least likely to be original because it combined the other two. Whichever manuscript best fits within the grammar and context of the sentence it is in, that should be preferred. The manuscript that most seems to match the style of the author should be preferred. And there were a few others as well. But the main thrust of their work came down to what should matter most is the age of a particular manuscript, not the number of manuscripts that agree. And while they absolutely took that methodology to the extreme, and pretty much all text critics today acknowledge that Westcott and Hort went a little too far with how strictly they followed that guideline, it does make sense, and I think is still arguably an improvement on just the idea that the majority reading is the best. Consider a game of Whisper Down the Lane, where you have, let's say, 20 people all lined up. The first person whispers something, a particular sentence, in the ear of the second person, who then whispers it to the third to the fourth to the fifth, so forth and so on, until you get to the last person in line, and when they say the sentence, it's usually ridiculously different than what the original sentence was. Now, I realize this is a flawed analogy, and I am sure there are plenty of people that would want to beat me up over saying this, but if we can just imagine textual criticism being like a game of Whisper Down the Lane, where we're trying to figure out, we're actually working backwards rather than forwards with it, and we're trying to figure out what was the original sentence that was said by the first person. If you have 10 out of those 20 people who all say the sentence is the exact same thing, that's a good clue. But if they are the last 10 people, what they all believe the sentence is together matters arguably less than what the second person in line says it means. Because even if the second person in line is the only person out of the 19 people past the first one who says it's this sentence, well, they were closest to the original. And so that one person is more likely to be close to the original sentence than the 10 people at the end of the line who all agreed the message was the same. So while older is better is certainly not a flawless methodology, there is something to that. And I realize people, especially those who prefer TR-based Bible, we'll get to all of that in a little bit here, will take issue with it. I do think that the work of Westcott and Hort is something that we cannot deny or just completely sweep under the rug or try to villainize them. They were not pawns of Satan who were trying to change the Bible. They were legitimate scholars who were trying to get as close to the text of the original as possible. They did not remove anything or change anything from the Bible. They just worked with the manuscripts that they had available, which were significantly more than what were available even 100 years before that. Now, granted, Westcott and Hort still worked within a very small segment of manuscripts, and they tended to favor Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus far more than they probably should have. By the way, that reminds me of being in a Greek class in college and learning about these different text traditions. And everyone has a different way of pronouncing Sinaiticus, but most people agree on Vaticanus. Except there was one person I remember in this class. He was a unique character, to say the least. And when the professor called on him to say, all right, one of the main texts from back then was Codex Sinaiticus, what was the other? And he yells out in the middle of class, Vaticanus! Right, that is not how we pronounce it. So it's not Vaticanus. I hear that in my head every time I see the word. Okay, it's Vaticanus. But circling back around now to just this last little section here. When you have a text critic that has multiple manuscripts of any given passage together, what they are trying to do is not undermine the Bible. They are not trying to critique the Bible. They are not trying to decide what does or doesn't belong in your Bible. What they are trying to do is figure out which of these manuscripts is likely closest to the original message that was written down. And as I have already beaten the horse dead, I am going to beat it a little bit more. Most of the time, this does not have any significant impact on the message of a given passage. And in the few times that it does, it is not anything that we need to be concerned about changing doctrine. I realize I'm being a little vague with some of that here in this episode just because it gets into such nerdy scholarly weeds. I mean, if you thought we were deep in the weeds here today, we can go so much further into the weeds to the point you can barely come up for air with some of it. So if this is stuff you're interested in or would like to hear more on, write in, let us know. I can absolutely talk more about it in detail. I'm just kind of trying to give an overview here today. So when you have a text critic trying to determine which of these is most likely closest to the original, they're looking at a handful of things. They're looking at the age of the fragment that they have in front of them. And that has to be determined by someone else. What is the likely age of this? And that can be determined through carbon dating. It can be through analysis of the paper or parchment that was used, or the animal skin if it was vellum. It can be on analyzing the writing style. In what century were people writing Greek in this general style? If you see somebody's handwriting, you might be able to trace back, if you were really nerdy and had the time to do this, you might be able to figure out, okay, what curriculum did they possibly learn writing from, when they were in elementary school? It's that sort of thing. And a lot of times these texts will be dated to about a 50-year range. So someone might say this text is probably from 200 to 250 CE, after Jesus. And that's just the range we have to work with because we don't actually know the exact precise date of any of these. So the text critic is drawing on all of that, trying to work with what's going to be the oldest text. They're going to look at the length of it and often try to prefer a shorter reading versus a longer reading. They're going to look at the simplicity, which one is a harder read. They're going to look for mistakes like copy errors. There's something called homoouteluton, which do not ask me to spell that. Just look it up, homoouteluton. It can be two words, it can be phrases, it can be lines of the text where the ending looks really similar. Like in English, maybe you would have two words side by side that both end in es. And so when the scribe writes down the first word and they go to write down the next word, they see the es of the second word and accidentally miscopying down that second word because they thought it was the ending of the first word. That's called homoouteluton. Another similar issue is homoiarche, and that's when you have two beginnings of lines that are similar. So an entire line of the text might accidentally be skipped. Say you have two different verses that both begin with, and Jesus said. It's possible for a scribe to miss the second one when they're copying, thinking that they had already copied it because all they saw was the "and Jesus said," and then they move on to the verse after that. It does happen sometimes. They also look at the grammar and the overall style and context and message of the book. They'll try to determine, okay, is this variation a word that the author has also used in this book? If it's a word that doesn't show up anywhere else in the book, maybe the author didn't use it there. Now, there are words called hapax legomena, which are one-time only words, where it's the only time it appears in a book or the only time it appears in the New Testament or what have you. So that is not a foolproof way of determining, but the text critic will weigh all of these things together. And it's not necessarily like one manuscript is going to be 100 points in favor of it while all the others are at 0. It's more going to be like, this one is 70% likely to be original, that one's like 30% likely. It's on a graded scale like that. And over time, scholars have refined these guidelines to the point that the majority of text criticism that is done today and the majority of translation work that is done today is based on eclecticism. Eclecticism is where you consult a large body of texts for this. You're not necessarily just drawing from manuscripts from one particular text tradition over another. You're comparing sometimes even different language translations together. Like you might look some at the Latin Vulgate, you might look a little bit at the Septuagint, Greek translation of the Tanakh, while also looking at the Masoretic text for the Old Testament and some Byzantine manuscripts for the New, mixed in with some Western manuscripts. And so it's looking at all of these different ones together, and the general guiding principle lately in scholarship has been the more you can look at, the more informed your translation is going to be, and the more likely you are to have an accurate translation when you're able to compare all these different text families together. I really appreciate that process because it helps to avoid errors of any one particular text family. Like people who are going to be from a King James only side, or they would say a TR only side a lot of times, Textus Receptus, they're going to only want to draw from one particular set of manuscripts. But in so doing, you are limiting yourself to the pros and cons of that particular text family. If you have this eclectic approach, you're able to compare multiple text families together and say, okay, where they all agree, that's likely to be good. Where there's variation, we can now compare and try to see what do the most number of manuscripts say versus what do the oldest manuscripts say versus what do the ones that come from this area say. And then you're able to weigh all those different things together and say, okay, well, this one is most likely to be the best option to go with. So at this point in the conversation, I have referenced text types or text families several times, and I think it's about time that we actually get into that. But first, let's take a quick brain break and then circle back. As more and more manuscripts have become available to text critics, they have started to notice patterns where certain manuscripts that come from a certain area tend to have similarities in their variants. So they might all spell a word a particular way that it isn't spelled in manuscripts from a different area. Or it might be missing a verse or have an extra verse, or a clause here that is 5 verses later than where it is in other manuscripts, that sort of thing. And so they start to group them together based on these similarities and call them text types or text families. Now, when we're dealing with the Old Testament, with the Tanakh, the prevailing text family is the Masoretic text. This is the defining text of the Hebrew Old Testament for the vast majority of the last 2,000 years. A couple hundred years after Jesus, some very skilled Jewish scribes called Masoretes got together and did textual criticism on the manuscripts available for the Old Testament, and they determined this critical text that they put together that came to be called after them. They were Masoretes. It is called the Masoretic text. And they were very meticulous in how they copied down the text and then set forth the standard for any future copies. But they also edited the text significantly because they added in vowel pointing and accents as well as punctuation. And that may not sound terribly significant, but it actually is, because in Hebrew, the majority of words, particularly verbs, center around what is called a triconsonantal root. Triconsonantal, so 3 consonants. Most Hebrew words, particularly verbs, center around 3 main consonants that make up the root of the word, and then you can add on things to it to have suffixes, prefixes, yada yada. The earliest Hebrew writing, pretty much up until the time of the Masoretes, didn't have vowel pointing. you just wrote the consonants of the word. You didn't write in the vowels. Now, when you spoke it, you still spoke the vowels. You can't just speak in consonants, but they weren't necessarily written. So you had to be very skilled in both the Hebrew language and the texts you were reading to discern, okay, here are these consonants. I'm going to then supply these vowels and, say this particular word. And that's all well and good, but if you don't have the vowels written down, different vowels can be supplied to the same consonants and sometimes make different words. Let's just imagine this in English for a second. Imagine you have the consonants B, D as the word, and you don't have any vowels there. You have to supply the vowels. What word is meant when you see B, D? Well, it could be bad, or it could be bed, or it could be bod, or bud, right? There's so many options that you can play with these words where it can mean different things with different vowels in it. So when the Masoretes added in these vowels, there were certain interpretive choices that they made for the text where sometimes people will go back and say, I'm not actually sure that was the best use of vowels here. If we add in these vowels instead, we get a different word, and maybe that makes more sense there. So while the Masoretic text is by far the most definitive and most popular version of the Old Testament text out there, it is certainly not the only one. We have talked before in this series and throughout the podcast of the Greek Septuagint, which was, as far as we can tell, one of the earliest religious translations of any text in human history. It is also one of the largest and most significant early translations in human history. It's when roughly 70 Jewish scribes got together and translated their Hebrew scriptures into the Greek language of the time. It was called the Septuagint. That was the version of the Bible, quote unquote, if you will. It wasn't necessarily grouped together like we tend to have, in our leather-bound Bibles today. It was more so just a collection of scrolls, and some communities may have had one version of it rather than another, or only some of the books. It varied from place to place, but that seems to be the version of it rather than the Hebrew scriptures that Jesus and the disciples and the early church and the New Testament writers would have been familiar with, because that is what they quote from most frequently. And it differs from the Hebrew Old Testament, what's established in the Masoretic text, in several places, sometimes even in relatively significant ways. So today, if you have someone who comes from like a King James only background, they're going to say that the Masoretic text is the only authoritative Hebrew scriptures. And yet what Jesus and the disciples and the early church and the New Testament writers had was the Greek Septuagint. And it has significant differences from the Hebrew Masoretic text in some places. And yet, apparently, it was good enough for Jesus and his followers. There's also the Syriac translation of the Old Testament, and then eventually also the New Testament works, called the Peshitta. You have the Samaritan Pentateuch, where the first 5 books, and only the first 5 books, were translated over into a sister dialect for the Samaritans. Then we also have the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they are super important because they collect together both Greek and a little bit of Hebrew, but quite a bit of Greek manuscripts of the Old Testament. And while they are mostly the same as the Septuagint and the Masoretic text and all that, they vary in some significant ways, including having 2 different versions of Isaiah, where sometimes the passages are different or the books aren't the same length. Even Jeremiah is significantly shorter in the Dead Sea Scrolls than in the Masoretic text, and the Dead Sea Scrolls are significantly older than the Masoretic text. So while the Masoretic text reigned supreme for quite a while as the only definitive guide for Old Testament Hebrew texts, it is now often supplemented with some of these other text traditions to try to get to something that most closely reflects the message of the original Tanakh scrolls. Moving into the New Testament, it really wasn't until the 1700s, when we had Bengel and Semler that we mentioned earlier, that divided New Testament manuscripts up into the Alexandrian, Western, and Byzantine text families. Westcott and Hort used similar delineations, and more recently, we have had Kurt Allen and his wife Barbara, who did quite a bit of text critical work, and they had 4 different categories: Alexandrian, Egyptian, or sometimes it's called eclectic or Caesarean. Every time I see that word, my brain wants to say Caesarean, but it's Caesarean, like Caesarea from the Bible. Third is Western, and then the 4th is Byzantine, sometimes called Syrian. As with anything else in biblical studies, these categories are highly debated, and not everyone agrees on how different texts should be classified, whether one belongs in one category or another. But I'll just work off of these four mainly, because these are going to be the four most common terms used. If we look at Western, the Western text type is not as common. It is a mixture of Greek and Latin manuscripts. It does possibly include some of our oldest manuscripts, but it doesn't seem to represent manuscripts for every book of the New Testament. And there are some scholars who don't even think that we should have a category of Western text type, thinking that it's basically just a subtype of one of the other categories. The Western texts tend to paraphrase a lot, so they're not usually considered reflective of the originals as much. The Caesarean text family is also a disputed category. It only applies to the Gospels. None of the other New Testament texts have any manuscripts that seem to fit this particular family. And its variations are a little weird. The most popular one is Matthew 27, around verse 16 or so, where Pilate releases, usually we would say Barabbas, but within certain manuscripts, the text says Jesus Barabbas rather than just Barabbas. So some manuscripts of Matthew 27 have Pilate offering two different Jesuses to the crowd. Do you want this Jesus of Nazareth or this Jesus Barabbas? Now, the majority of manuscripts just call him Barabbas, so that's why these are kind of set aside as maybe they're coming from a different region that added this part in or had this as a different tradition, or, maybe it came from someone who actually knew they had the same name and the other authors left off. It's all subject to debate how valid that reading is. But because of these differences, sometimes texts like that in the Gospels are grouped in this Caesarean family. By the way, as you could probably tell, these groupings are usually named off of the region that they likely came from. So Western text family would not mean Western like North America Western, but Western in the sense of the Western Church in the Middle East and Europe. So not like the Eastern side that became Greek Orthodox or anything like that, but rather the Western side that was more so Catholic. Caesarean would be in the area of Caesarea, Alexandrian in the area of Alexandria, Egypt, and Byzantine in the more east side of the Roman Empire. So speaking of Alexandrian, that's the third category we'll talk about here. These tend to be our oldest manuscripts. They tend to follow the textual apparatus of a lot of text critics of having shorter readings, more difficult readings. There's a lot of variation in between the manuscripts in the Alexandrian family. Byzantine is the fourth category. These are going to mostly be later manuscripts. We don't really start getting noteworthy numbers of these manuscripts until about 900 years after Jesus, with the majority of them being only about 500 to 800 years old from our time right now. So they tend to be significantly newer fragments. They tend to have less variation amongst them. There's more agreement amongst the Byzantine text type than any of the other families. That being said, there is still a lot of variation. Now, because those Byzantine texts were more recent, often in better condition, and more accessible because there were more of them, the earliest translations of the Bible into English tended to use Byzantine texts. The more manuscripts we've discovered, the further back in time we have been able to move with them. Now, granted, we have also found more recent ones too, but as time has progressed, we have started to move further back in our record of manuscripts. So the earlier English Bibles had to use the Byzantine text because that was really all they had access to. But because of its connection then to the King James, since the King James translators used mostly Byzantine texts, it became a battleground later on where certain people not only favored the Byzantine texts, but actually started to say that those were the only acceptable ones. And that's a whole other matter getting into King James onlyism that I really wanted to cover today, but just given the amount of time that we have, I don't think I can do that with the appropriate care that it needs. So I'm going to push that a little further into the future, but hopefully that whets your appetite a little bit for just realizing a little bit that lies underneath the surface of the Bible translation debate. That being said, we are not done with this episode yet, because I promised I would get you from where the Bible was written to our modern day English Bibles. So all we have done so far is talked about the different categories for these ancient manuscripts. We haven't even talked about translation yet. So with the last bit of this episode here, I want to bring you up from the time of these manuscripts to today. Let's return briefly to our thought experiment from earlier. Let's go back in time 500 years and imagine you are living in a monastery and you want to create a critical edition of the Bible's text. What do? Let's say you only have 3 manuscripts available to you in your monastery, and you have to then go try to find some others and put them together and painstakingly compare back and forth. And by the way, a lot of these manuscripts are not easy to read. I am a language nerd. I studied Greek and Hebrew in college. As you can tell if you've listened to the podcast, I know my way around them enough to be dangerous. I wouldn't necessarily say I'm proficient in them, but I can get the job done. That's because I'm using digitized versions of these Greek and Hebrew texts, where it's in nice, clean, broken out chapter and verse divisions. It's in lines, just like a lot of our English Bibles are. If you actually put, let's just say, a Greek manuscript in front of me from even 600 years ago, I would have a really hard time reading it, because when you move from font on a computer to handwriting, that's a lot more difficult. And then when you're dealing with older versions of the writing, and each person has their own little idiosyncrasies, I might not know those as well. And then especially if it's an older manuscript from like 1500 years ago and it's in majuscule and you don't have spaces in between the words, like it gets ridiculously hard to read. So anyone dealing with the actual physical manuscripts is a genius in my book for being able to discern them. Like if you just search online for pictures of these manuscripts, it's tough to read, even if you studied biblical languages in school. So I just want to say that to give you an appreciation for what the people we're about to talk about did, because it took a lot of work. And this little hypothetical of, being 500 years ago and wanting to create a critical edition of the biblical text, that's not so hypothetical, because there was a guy named Erasmus, Desiderius Erasmus. He lived in the early 1500s, and the printing press from the modern West as we know it was created in 1440. So Erasmus was one of the first people ever to have a printed edition of the Greek New Testament. That was in 1516. In the early 1500s, Erasmus was a Catholic priest who was a serious fanboy of Jerome's work. Jerome had translated the Bible into Latin hundreds upon hundreds of years earlier, creating what was known as the Vulgate. Well, Erasmus realized that there were variations in manuscripts of the Vulgate as well. As it got copied over time, there were mistakes, and there were additions, and there were subtractions, and so he decided, I want to get down to the original text of the Vulgate as closely as possible. So he gathered together a bunch of manuscripts and tried to create a critical edition, not of Greek, but of Latin. Now, while he was doing that, he created a polyglot. A polyglot is when you have 2 different translations side by side. And so he not only did Latin, he also started to add in Greek. Now, his main focus was the Latin. The Greek was a side note to him. And yet the work that he did became the basis for what would eventually become the Textus Receptus, the TR, that would be used with the King James Bible. So for anyone who comes from King James only circles, I like to remind them that their King James Bible is completely dependent on a Greek text that was developed by a Catholic priest. And that usually doesn't go over too great, but it's an awesome fact. Now, what Erasmus had to work with was only roughly 8 manuscripts. Now, there's some difference. Some people will say he had about 6, others will say he had a couple dozen, but the general agreement is he had only around 8 manuscripts. Now get this, all of them dating from after 1000 CE. So he was dealing with not full codices, not full copies of the New Testament from Matthew to Revelation. He was dealing just with manuscripts, and each one had different books. So about 4 of them had parts of the Gospels. 3 of them included Acts. 4 of them included the epistles, and only 1 of them included Revelation. So when we say he worked with roughly 8 different manuscripts to create this early critical edition of the New Testament, we don't mean that he had 8 different versions of Matthew to Revelation and compared them all together. With Matthew through John, he only had about 4 different ones that he was comparing back and forth. When he got to Revelation, he was basically just working off of one text and copying it. And in fact, he was missing parts of Revelation from that. So he took the Latin Vulgate and translated that back into Greek. It was already a translation from Greek. He translated it back into Greek to put those verses back into Revelation that were missing from his one manuscript of it. Now, this was all going on at the same time that some other scholars were working on a polyglot as well. So many scholars believe he kind of had to rush a little bit of his work, particularly in Revelation, to try to get his critical edition out before what became known as the Complutensian Polyglot. Don't you love these technical names? Complutensian Polyglot. Gotta love it. And when Erasmus finally did complete his work, he dedicated it to the Pope who excommunicated Martin Luther. So, again, remember, this guy was Catholic. He was not a Baptist. If you are a King James onlyist or even a TR onlyist, you would not invite the guy that was essential in creating the TR to preach in your church. He would not be welcome there. And it's not even like once he finished that, that became the TR that became the basis for the New Testament in the King James. No, we are still several steps removed from that, because within his own lifetime, he continued to edit his work as he went back and had a little more time and said, oh, okay, I made a spelling error here, or I miscopied this here. Because, again, he's doing a lot of this by hand until the point that he gets it printed. So there were 5 or 6 different editions of his own critical text in his own lifetime. There's a passage that is commonly debated as one of these quote-unquote missing passages in the New Testament, 1 John 5, 7 through 8. We actually talked about back at the start of the episode. Erasmus didn't even include those verses in until his 3rd revision. And even then, he only did it because he was bowing to social pressure. He didn't himself believe that it was original. He just didn't want to cause a fuss with leaving it out. But even by the time of his death, the critical edition that he had is still pretty different from the majority text that is behind the TR of the King James. There's roughly a couple thousand differences between his work and what would come just 100 plus years later. That leads us next to Robert Estienne, or more often called Robertus Stephanus, or often just Stephanus or Stephanus, or some variation of that. He was a printer from Paris in the 1500s. He was raised Catholic, later converted to Protestantism, and he actually joined John Calvin's Geneva community and worked as a printer for Calvin's writings. He was one of the first people to print the New Testament divided into the numbered verses that we are used to today. So we're talking mid-1500s. None of the Bibles before that had the verse divisions that we are used to. That's less than 500 years old. Now, in addition to the other stuff he printed, he did print Bibles in Latin as early as 1528. But then he started working on his own critical edition of the Greek New Testament and printed it in 1546. It is very similar to the collection that Erasmus put together, but Stephanus didn't actually credit Erasmus and said that he was doing his own work, but there is debate over how much he may have actually ended up copying some of Erasmus's work. Granted, he had over a dozen manuscripts available to him. So mind you, when we're talking about today, we have over 6,000 manuscripts. We are talking about a dozen being a lot at this point, not even 500 years ago. And by 1551, he actually combined Erasmus's Latin translation with the Vulgate and his own translation. Next up is a little blip in the history books by the name of Simon de Collins. He republished Erasmus's works unauthorized because he actually combined Erasmus's critical edition with the Complutensian Polyglot that was in competition with Erasmus's. But not much ever came of that, so he's just kind of overlooked in a lot of the history of text criticism. However, around the same time, there was a very influential text critic by the name of Theodore Beza. He was a French Calvinist in the 1500s who took over the Geneva community from Calvin after Calvin died. In 1565, he printed an edition of the Greek New Testament alongside the Vulgate and his own translation. So, mind you, with each step here, each scholar is revising the work of the previous person. And as they are getting more and more information and access to more manuscripts over time, they are then re-evaluating what they had before and slightly altering these agreed-upon collections to try to get as close to the original as possible. So remember, no one is changing the Bible. No one is going back and changing manuscripts or anything like that. The matter is just that they are now looking at more manuscripts and they're getting fresh sets of eyes on previous work and saying, okay, this guy actually missed something here, or he didn't have access to this particular manuscript. So now that we have access to it, and now that we caught this error, we can refine it a little bit. That brings us up to 1633, when Bonaventure Elzevir and his nephew Abraham further refined and printed their own critical edition of the New Testament text. And because the Elzevirs were professional printers and savvy businessmen, they decided to have a little marketing pitch for their particular edition, because by now we have multiple different editions out there, and some people are using Beza's, and some are using Stephanus's, and some are using Erasmus's, and so they want to make money because this is their copy that they are printing. So they decide to put this little preface on their work, and it read, Textum ergo aves nunc ab omnibus receptum, in quod nihil immutatam aut corruptum damos. Please forgive my Latin, is not one of my stronger languages. Translated into English, so you hold the text, now received by all, in which nothing is corrupt. Over time, two of those Latin words got picked out of that sentence and put side by side, textum and receptum, and became textus receptus, or TR, or put into English, received text. Now, I realize, to many of you listening out there, that may not mean much, but if you came from a King James only background, that means the world to you. Because most King James onlyists are going to say that a good Bible has to come from the TR, from the Textus Receptus, is the only reliable version of the Greek text put together. But do you remember when I said that the Elzevirs printed their so boldly named Textus Receptus? 1633. The King James was first written in 1611. There was no TR back in 1611. Now granted, the edition that the Elzevirs put out, that they ended up calling a received text, is very close to the earlier work of Beza and Stephanus and Erasmus and all that. Like, if you put them all side by side, Beza, Stephanus, Erasmus, Elzevir, they are very similar. You know, again, a lot of this work is very tedious, very minuscule differences back and forth. It's not the kind of thing that's going to make a major difference, but it is still different. And so to say that the King James is a TR translation would be like saying that the Pilgrims landed in the United States of America. Is that a true statement? Kind of yes, kind of no. Like, the land that they landed on is the same thing, but it wouldn't be called the United States of America for another 150-ish years. So let's recap here, because I realize that's a lot of information. As far as printed critical editions of the Greek text go, we have the Complutensian Polyglot. Technically, it was first printed in 1514. It wasn't really widely published until 1522, so there's kind of some back and forth on whether that was first or Erasmus was first, because his first edition came out in 1516, so in between the original printing of Complutensian, but before it was actually circulated. Erasmus had about 5 or 6 editions going into 1535. And we have the Collinnaeus edition from 1534, which combined Erasmus and the Complutensian. Stephanus's various editions and revisions from 1546 to 1551. Beza's 9 editions from Geneva between 1965 and 1604. Then we have the King James comes in, uses a mixture actually of Erasmus's work, Stephanus's work, the Complutensian Polyglot, and Beza's work, as well as consulting a little bit of the Vulgate. Then, over 10 years later, we have the Elzevir family bring the editions of 1624, 1633, and 1641. And it was the 1633 version that they boldly called the Textus Receptus, and the marketing worked because people started going, oh, this is the text that everybody has claimed to receive and has no change whatsoever. By the way, if the 1633 edition that they gave that preface to, where there was no corruption whatsoever and it was received by all, why did they need to edit it again in 1641? Just a thought. So up until that point, all of these are only based on a handful of late manuscripts, pretty much from 1,000+ years after Jesus. Oh, one other edition I almost forgot to mention comes from Frederick Henry Ambrose Scrivener. He was a vicar in the Church of England who worked in the 1840s to 1870s to create a single version of the Greek New Testament to match what the King James translators used. So Scrivener actually worked backwards from English into Greek to come up with a new edition of the Elsevier's Textus Receptus based on the King James that was then used by him and others to update the King James to the revised version of the Bible in the 1880s and 90s. So Scrivener's version was not really an update of the TR. It was saying, let's take the TR that the Elsevier family came up with and let's compare it to the King James. And since the King James translators weren't using the Elsevier text, they were using Beza and Erasmus and Stephanus, let's create a version of the TR that is basically retrofitted from the King James. So his was kind of a topsy-turvy critical edition. Now, in between the time of the King James and the time of Scrivener, we started to get access to more manuscripts. And so this is where Johann Bengel shows up again in the early 1700s. In 1725 and 1734, he edited critical editions of the Greek New Testament. In the late 1700s, Griesbach built on that work, but started adding in other translations from other languages and comparing their text traditions to the Greek and Latin ones that they had available at that time. Then along comes Karl Lachmann, and he is one of the first people to say, I'm not sure that we should keep following this line that kind of became standardized with the Textus Receptus. Because remember, the Textus Receptus is only based on a small number of manuscripts from that time. Now, as we've discovered more manuscripts, we've realized that the majority of manuscripts we have do actually match what is in the Textus Receptus. But that wasn't known at the time. Calling it the majority text was just working off of a few dozen manuscripts that were available. You know, if you have only 5 people in the room, well, 3 is a majority. So Lachmann has been influenced by some of the other text critical scholars that we've talked about in the episode, and he starts saying, what if what matters most isn't the number of witnesses to a particular text family, but the age of it? Because remember, most of the Byzantine texts that form the Textus Receptus are from the last 1,000 years of human history. Lachmann wanted to focus instead on the older texts, some of the Alexandrian texts. And then this is followed up on by Konstantin von Tischendorf. He's a big name in text criticism, and he worked mostly with Codex Sinaiticus. Then along come Westcott and Hort, and they published their New Testament in the original Greek in 1881. Like Lachmann, they focused pretty much entirely on going with the oldest texts in their opinion, pretty much to a fault. Now, once we get into the turn of the 1900s, this is where eclecticism starts becoming more popular, and we start comparing more of these text families together instead of just trying to pick only the majority in the Byzantine family or only the oldest in the Alexandrian family. So in 1901, Rudolf Kittel produced a critical edition of the Hebrew Bible that became known as the Biblia Hebraica Editit Rudolf Kittel, or BH1. For most of you, that's not going to mean anything, but over time, as this has been edited, it became the kind of the standard for Old Testament text criticism. We have BH2, BH3. Then along came the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia. Gotta love these German names. Scholars in Stuttgart, Germany, worked to create a modern copy of the Leningrad Codex, which is the oldest codex we have for the Old Testament, adding in notes on textual variants. While Kittel's work with BH1, 2, and 3 was very influential, the work of Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia has become kind of the standard by this point. And so if scholars are working on a translation of the Tanakh, of the Old Testament, they are probably looking at the 4th edition of BHS right now. And there's a 5th edition that should be coming out within the next decade. For the New Testament, the same thing has happened, primarily with the work of Eberhard Nessel and Kurt Allen. So it's called the Nestle-Allen text, or the Novum Testamentum Grace, or NA, and then with each revision, a number is added. We are currently on NA 28. So whenever you have an English Bible translated today, they're going to be using BHS for the Old Testament and NA for the New Testament, and they'll go with whatever the current edition of it is. Because each edition, again, this is not about changing the text. These revisions happen every 5 to 20-ish years. So it's a matter of these scholars saying, what have we learned in the last years since the previous edition? What new manuscripts have been discovered? What mistakes did we catch in our previous work? Where has scholarship developed to the point that we think maybe we actually made a wrong decision here before? And then they collect all of that information. They go back, they look at the previous edition, they say, okay, where do we think we need to make changes? And then groups of scholars say, all right, we're going to try to revise this, all always with the goal of trying to get to a version of the text that is as close to the original as possible. And I realize it can be really confusing when we talk about all these different variations. I mean, heck, it's confusing enough sometimes with all the different versions we have in English, right? Let alone talking about all the different variations in other languages. But while I realize this can be overwhelming for a lot of people, I think it's a very important conversation to have. I realize very few, if any of you listening to this, are going to become text critics or Bible scholars or people who work with the Bible full time. That's just not what most people do. Just like most people aren't mechanics or most people aren't plumbers or doctors, or right? We have all these different professions, and we're not saying everyone needs to be one of them, but we're thankful for the ones who are. Same thing here with Bible. Like, I realize not everyone is going to be a Bible nerd like this. But that being said, there are certain things about Bible nerdiness that I think it's useful for the average person to understand. So just like you might never become a plumber, but it's useful for you to know a few basics of plumbing so you can save yourself $50 to $100 when all you needed to do was use a plunger on your toilet rather than call a plumber. Same thing with the Bible. There are some basics that I think it's useful for everyone to know so that they have a better understanding of their English text. I'm not saying that you need to read in Greek or Hebrew to understand what the Bible's actually saying. If anything from this study, I hope you've been able to see that the work that goes into your English Bible, so much behind the scenes that you probably did not even realize is there. It is so tedious, laborious, complex. There are so many checks and balances that what you hold in your hands as an English Bible is a reliable translation. And whether it's going all the way back to the King James or whether it's the most recent edition of the NIV, you have a reliable copy of the Bible there in your hands. Now, yes, they are all going to differ because they have different translation philosophies, and some might be trying to get closer to the cadence of the Greek or Hebrew text, whereas others are trying to put it into smoother English, or this one, only worked with that particular text family, whereas this one is eclectic and tries to combine all of them. Like, that's why there are so many differences, because there's so many different philosophies behind it all. And honestly, the whole translation issue is something I want to talk about more in the future, and I definitely want to talk about English Bibles because there is so much more to get into with all of that. But my goal with this study was just to help you to appreciate a little more the Bible you hold in your hands on a Sunday, taking you from scroll to screen, because I realize now most people are probably just using YouVersion or something along those lines, but to show you that this isn't just something that we should flippantly open up on a Sunday. This is 2,000 plus years of scholarship, blood, sweat, tears, like literally blood. Some people have died for this in the past to bring us an ever improving edition of the biblical text. Don't look at the different versions out there today as competitions with each other. It's not like fast food restaurants. Am I going to go to McDonald's or Wendy's or Burger King or Chick-fil-A or whatever, right? No, they are more like revisions of each other. And this is something we'll have to talk about when we talk about the translations. But actually, a lot of the English translations that we have are connected to each other. Many of them are revisions of previous versions that you may not have even realized. Like, for example, how the ESV stems from the RSV, which stems from the RV, which stems from the King James. Like, we can trace a lot of these back. And so I think it's more helpful to view these different Bible translations and updates that we get pretty much every year at this point as not being in competition with each other like the fast food restaurants, but more like the updates on your phone or on your laptop that you get. Now, I am not an Apple person, but right now, as of the time of this recording, if you have an Apple device, you are on iOS 18, at least assuming you have the most recent update. That is not to say that every single version of Apple before iOS 18 was wrong, or bad, or useless. iOS 18 doesn't mean that every previous iteration was suddenly inaccurate or unhelpful. It just means that the existence of those previous versions allowed the next version to happen. It is because of the foundation of those earlier versions that we are able to continually improve. It's not like 18 completely rejected all of the previous ones and said, this is the only good version ever. No, it built on the shoulders. It stood on the shoulders of the previous versions and made slight revisions. Now, we all know people who don't like when their devices update and who put off updating to the latest version as long as humanly possible until the computer literally forces them to do that. Change can be difficult to accept, even when it's for the better. Even though 18 may be objectively an improvement on certain aspects of 17, there are going to be some people who got so used to 17 that they just don't want to switch to 18. And that's okay. 17 isn't invalid just because 18 exists, but they are going to miss out on some of the minor benefits of having the updated iOS 18. Hopefully you can see the point of the analogy here. Bible translations are the same way. Just because there is a new translation that comes out or a revision of a particular translation comes out does not mean that every previous Bible was wrong. It does not mean that that is the only good one. It doesn't mean that there won't be revisions again in the future. And it doesn't mean that if you prefer or got used to a previous version, that you have to switch or else you don't truly have the words of God. Not at all. But we also shouldn't dismiss the newer versions because they're not made out of hand. They're not made flippantly. They're not made by people who hate the Bible. They're made by people who have dedicated their entire lives to trying to present to laymen the closest to the original version of the Bible as humanly possible with our current understanding, even if it means getting so deep into the weeds of the minutiae of the text that all they're changing is the spelling of a word here, or updating the definition of a word as we've learned more of what it means since we've discovered other ancient work from that time and learned that maybe we didn't have a full definition of the word back then. Like, these people have dedicated their entire lives to dealing with such nerdiness just to try to get you the best possible edition out there. Friends, Bible translation work never ends. Text criticism will continue as long as humans are around. And that's a good thing. It means we are slowly improving. Now, if you were to take the most recent Bible translation in English that you can find and compare it to the King James, it's still going to be significantly the same. Now, yes, the language will be very different because 400 years of English language has changed a lot, but the actual message, and if you get down to, what are these words saying? They're going to be saying the same thing in the majority of the time. I know I am already beating this dead horse. You don't have to tell me. I promise this is the last time today. I just want to bring it up again because I know where I came from. And I know how I would have viewed, how I did view these conversations for the majority of my life and how uncomfortable they made me and how much I squirmed and tried to reason my way out of it. The Bible is a challenging, complex book. And if your study of it isn't challenging you, you're probably not studying it right. It's supposed to. So I just welcome you, regardless of where you are on your faith journey or what you've thought of Bible translations before, just to live in the dissonance of some of this difficulty. And maybe you listened and you thought this was super cool and interesting and no problems. Or maybe you listened and it put you on edge with some stuff. Don't feel like you have to resolve every tension right away. I mean, like I mentioned at the start of the episode, I had to take extra time for this episode. I worked hard on this for probably about a month. And even in that time, I realized I need a week without publishing an episode just so I can make sure I get all of this right. And this is the sort of thing I do for fun, right? I went to school for this. I studied this. I read books about this. I listen to podcasts about this. Like, this is my free time. And yet, even in all of that, I said, man, I think I need more time to study this and make sure we're getting it right. So I don't expect someone to listen to a hour and 45-minute podcast and automatically have all of their questions answered about text criticism. I probably raised more than I answered, and that's okay. If you have questions on this, civil thoughts or comments, we would love to hear from you. You can write in on our website's homepage. You can comment on our socials. Email is cconn@thebibleuncut.com. We also just started up a new Discord that is linked to on our socials. You can go on there and carry on this conversation. I really enjoy studying this, and I enjoy talking about it with people. And there's so much more we could have gone into, but I want to be respectful of your time and not talk for 5 hours straight. So please, feel free to keep the conversation going. We love to hear from you. Congrats on making it through this very dense mini-series from Scroll to Screen, the Bible's journey through time and technology. Congratulations. I am giving a round of applause here for you. That I am impressed. It warms my heart to think that you went on this journey with me and dove headfirst into the weeds with me on it. We are probably only going to have one more episode this year, and it is going to be a Christmas episode. We'll see exactly how it goes. Who knows? Sometimes I end up breaking episodes up into two that I thought were just going to be one because I talk way too long. But it is going to be Christmas, and we're going to be talking about prophecies related to the birth of Jesus and what we get right and what we get wrong there. So I absolutely love Christmas, and I love talking about the Christmas story in the Bible, so I cannot wait for that. But for now, I'll just say, stay curious and keep asking questions about the Uncut and Unfiltered Bible. You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.